Okay, chapter 12. We are up to the mid to late 1970s. The Beatles. You thought we were done? Not quite. Their album Revolver came out when? Yeah, August of 66. You're right. Revolver was released. One of the songs on Revolver was a song called Gotta Get You Into My Life. It had never been released as a single in the United States, and there was a bit of resurgence in the interest of the Beatles. All four Beatles were still alive. There was a lot of talk about Beatles reunion. And "Gotta Get You Into My Life" was released as a single in 1976, and like most things Beatles, went to the top 10. Give it a listen. Originally from Revolver, a top 10 hit in 76 for the Beatles, "Gotta Get You Into My Life." Less than 2 years later, the great R&B funk band Earth, Wind and Fire did a remake of "Gotta Get You Into My Life." One of the best remakes in rock history, frankly, because they took this song by the greatest band in rock and they redid it. They put their own spin on it. They completely made it their own. And "Gotta Get You Into My Life" by Earth, Wind and Fire is simply spectacular. Give it a listen. Completely different than the Beatles version, but unbelievable in its own right. Give it a listen. "Gotta Get You Into My Life," Earth, Wind and Fire. Unbelievably good remake. All right. One of the things I want you to take away from this particular session is how many enormous, enormously popular albums were released in the late 1970s by some of the greatest artists in rock history, but absolutely some of the biggest artists of the day. Artists from Billy Joel to Fleetwood Mac to Steely Dan, the Eagles, Stevie Wonder. Um, they released some of the biggest albums of their careers during this time. It was really, quite frankly, it was a great time to be a fan of rock and roll. Great albums came out. Let's start with Springsteen. Springsteen will go down as one of the great artists in rock and roll history. He was called the next Dylan. In a lot of ways, he was. He, great singer, great songwriter, great guitar player, great entertainer, and he stood for something. Springsteen stood up for what he believed in, and he had a tradition of standing up for the working class hero, for folks who, did work hard for their money and tried to raise their families and, keep their homes and all of that, and were constantly having difficulty doing so as a result of whether it was government intervention or bad luck or you name it, the inequities of the universe. Springsteen gave them a voice. Rolling Stone magazine famously called him, I guess it wasn't that famous because I'm about to get the quote wrong, but I think they called him the future of rock and roll or the future face of rock and roll when he hadn't even been heard of. Great New Jersey guy, but he could very well come from Indiana or Kansas. Springsteen. Born to Run was his first extraordinary album that crossed over and became a monster hit and a classic. Title track was a hit single as well. Springsteen, Born to Run. Another of the biggest albums from the late 1970s. Mentioned it last time. The album Rumors by the band Fleetwood Mac. Unbelievably good album, but hugely popular as well. Spent six, no, longer than that, 9 months in the top 10. Or no, I'm wrong. 9 months at number one. And Rumors was the number one album of 1978. It was just great. It was just a great album. Several hit singles from it, but the song that I want you to listen to is a song that was never released as a single yet. Now, 45 years later, it's one of those songs from Rumors that if you're even a modest Fleetwood Mac fan, you know the chain. All right, the chain, Fleetwood Mac from Rumors, another of the great albums that came out during that time, as was an album called Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder, the 1970s were very good to him, and he was very good to the 1970s, quite frankly, because he was no longer this kid. Remember 12-year-old Stevie Wonder, the harmonica, and he wasn't that kid anymore. And he wasn't sort of a product of Motown anymore, which for a lot of the 1960s, he was part of that machine that created the Supremes and the Temptations and Marvin Gaye. By the 1970s, like Marvin Gaye came with What's Going On, Stevie Wonder really started doing his own thing and he started creating some immensely good music. Songs in the Key of Life, the biggest album of his career, and from that album, Sir Duke. Stevie Wonder, Sir Duke from Songs in the Key of Life. Great album. Steely Dan, another band who had been around during the 1970s. We heard Reelin' in the Years a couple weeks back that we played. And Steely Dan made some extraordinary music, just some great music. The apex, the real peak of their career in terms of commercial success, and some would argue in terms of critical success, was an album called Aja, AJA. And it was released in 77. Huge hit album. And the biggest hit from the album was a song called Peg, Steely Dan from Aja. Peg, Steely Dan. And another band, one of the biggest American rock bands of the 70s, the Eagles. Um, and the Eagles now have two of the three largest selling albums in rock history. And Hotel California is one of those songs that has become known around the world. I have taught students from many countries, and when you teach American music to students abroad, you find out, I'm sorry, when you teach music that is popular in America, you find out what plays in other parts of the world. And the Beatles play, and Michael Jackson plays, and Queen plays. Those are the three artists that I found that kids from South America, from Asia, from Africa, they tend to know that music. But one song that I have found that they know as well is this, Hotel California, the title track from an immensely popular album by the Eagles. The Eagles. And the last of these enormous artists that just released these classic albums in the late 70s, Billy Joel, who would go on to be one of the biggest artists of the 80s. When he released The Stranger in 77, and then he released an album called 52nd Street in 79, and an album called Glass Houses in 1980. He came out with one huge album after another. But The Stranger was the album that put Billy Joel on the map as a superstar. He'd already done some stuff, but The Stranger was the one that sort of solidified it. Great songs have been released from The Stranger as singles: Just the Way You Are, Only the Good Die Young, Moving Out. But I chose to include a great tune called Scenes from an Italian Restaurant. Give it a listen. This is from The Stranger by Billy Joel. All right. Scenes from an Italian Restaurant from The Stranger, Billy Joel. The late 70s, amazing albums by some of the biggest artists in rock history. And still, here it is, almost 5 decades later. And albums like Born to Run by Springsteen, Rumors by Fleetwood Mac, Hotel California by the Eagles, Asia by Steely Dan, Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder, The Stranger by Billy Joel. And I didn't even do all the albums from the late 70s that were extraordinary. You had debut album by The Cars, debut album by Van Halen, Breakfast in America by Supertramp, Minute by Minute by the Doobie Brothers. There were some terrific albums during this time. I picked these as representative of that class. So 1970s, late 1970s, definitely some amazing albums. Okay, I'll catch you on the next one.